It's chapter 9 and we've reached the end of part 1. Congratulations! But there is a lot to talk about. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. The first part of chapter 9 focuses on the fallout from Tommy and Ruth's breakup. Pretty early on in the chapter, we get to hear some conversations Kathy has with Cynthia and then Hannah, and both of these conversations convince her that Hailsham as a whole thinks that Kathy will be the natural successor, meaning she'll be the next one to date Tommy. A position complicated by the fact that Tommy's ex, Ruth, is one of Kathy's closest and oldest friends. The most immediate result is Kathy abandons her plans to sleep with Harry. And again in this, we see how Ishiguro gives us the relatable before following it up with the extraordinary. Kathy sees the person that she almost was with in school later on in life. And as she's reflecting on the other time she sees Harry, it's not at a class reunion or a bar the night before Thanksgiving, but when he's wheelchair-bound due to the physical toll his donations had on him. I think that's the interesting thing about this chapter. There's a real focus on a relatable situation. Kathy probably likes Tommy, but feels she can't date him because of what's happened between her and Ruth, and then Harry's dragged into it, and she doesn't know what to do, and it's all very typical for teenagers. But what's not typical is to have your organs harvested when you're in, like, your 30s. So that is infused within Ishiguro's overall novel in a very interesting way that I think really draws the readers in. Anyway, back to the relationship between Tommy and Ruth. Ruth gives an interesting request that we can, in this request, we can see just how close Ruth and Kathy are. For instance, it's on page 103 in my book, but when they get back to Kathy and Ruth's dorm, they sit on each other's beds. And this, as someone who's had multiple roommates, would be weird for me. You know, I've been close with many of my roommates, but we don't usually sit on each other's beds. So I think that really shows that there is a closeness and comfortability with these two, which makes sense. They've been roommates basically their entire lives. And Ruth also confides solely in Kathy. She tells Kathy that she's not bringing this conversation up with Tommy or this request with Tommy for anyone else. And before we get too far, we should mention the request is that Ruth wants Kathy to help her get Tommy back, which is again complicated by the fact that Kathy is pretty close to Tommy and is kind of seeing herself through the eyes of the other students as the natural successor to the relationship with Tommy. And when Kathy finally does agree to talk to Tommy and convince him to be back with Ruth, there's some interesting stuff that comes up. Kathy gets pretty upset with Tommy based on the way he's smiling and laughing and seems to be covering up his pain. She says, "I didn't know much then about the world that awaited us beyond Hailsham, but I guessed we'd need all our wits about us, and when Tommy did anything like this, I felt something close to panic." So whether it be Tommy covering up his pain or we're going to talk about what happens with him and Miss Lucy, Kathy seems to have this real desire to protect Tommy, and we see this throughout the novel. She feels guilty about not telling him about the unzipping of his elbow. The novel starts with Kathy taking some mercy on him and trying to keep him from ruining his favorite rugby shirt. And now she's trying to protect him from what's going to happen after Hailsham. And even before that, she's trying to figure out if this relationship with Ruth is actually a good idea, because this awkwardness that she's feeling with Tommy is all compounded by the fact that Ruth cheated on Tommy. So is she protecting Tommy by having him be with Ruth, which is what she tells Tommy, that it's a smart move to be with Ruth, or would she be protecting him more by keeping him away from Ruth, someone that's really hurt him? And however interested you were in Kathy and Tommy and Ruth's love triangle, it immediately kind of falls away from more interesting events, at least on the outside of the story, which is that Miss Lucy calls Tommy into her study and basically rescinds her advice to Tommy about his art. Advice that, I probably don't need to remind you, saved his life. I mean, look at Tommy's turnaround from the beginning of the novel. There's no more fits of rage. He's a skilled and dedicated athlete, and he's taking Ruth's cheating and breakup incredibly well. And yet, listen to what Miss Lucy has to say about Tommy's current track at Hailsham. Listen, Tommy, your art, it is important. And not just because it's evidence, but for your own sake. You'll get a lot from it, just for yourself. So like I said, Tommy seems to have really improved as a person, and part of that seems to be due by the pressure of creating being taken off of him by Miss Lucy. And here she is going back on that advice. And in fact, she's so worried about Tommy that she hugs him, which Tommy and Kathy both admit is a very strange thing to have happen to an older Hailsham student. And this takes us to the big news that ends part 1. The students are, or at least Kathy is in what's called a culture briefing, which really shows you how isolated Hailsham is, since the students have to attend classes on how to interact with waiters and waitresses and police officers and government workers and all that sort of stuff. So they're in one of these culture briefings when someone comes in and basically shares the news that Miss Lucy is leaving. And Kathy immediately, once she confirms it, wants to go be the person to tell Tommy this news so that someone else doesn't hear it first. Again, we see that Kathy is trying to protect Tommy. But Kathy does not get to Tommy in time, but we do get to see his reaction through Kathy's eyes. Tommy's eyes looked empty. That very evening, Tommy and Ruth got back together again. So as Tommy hears the news about Miss Lucy leaving, he turns back to Ruth. For whatever reason, you'll find out more as you continue to read. But this is really interesting that Miss Lucy leaves. She's certainly been the guardian that's been focused upon the most. Obviously, Miss Emily's in charge, and Miss Geraldine was maybe going to be kidnapped when they were kids. Probably not, just a game. But Miss Lucy is by far the guardian that we've had the most focus on, including this chapter. And on reflection, she seems to be someone who's really stressed and frustrated by her job. We see her scribbling out the papers in the classroom when Kathy stumbles upon her. We see the conversation she's had with Tommy about how his art isn't that important, and then all of a sudden his art is important. And Miss Lucy, at least for the readers, is the one who breaks the big news about what's going to happen to these students when they're under the pavilion talking about their future plans. And when you think about the job that Miss Lucy has, raising these students from basically birth into adolescence, and then sending them out into the world where they are going to be killed rather young in life, that would be an immensely stressful and difficult position to have. So we don't know exactly why Miss Lucy leaves. Maybe the stress wears her out. Maybe she's dissatisfied with the direction Hailsham is going. Maybe she did something and has been let go. We're not fully privy to that information yet. But there's one thing I want you to reflect upon that Miss Lucy says in this chapter. If we could bounce back real quick to the conversation she has with Tommy. This is page 109 in my book. She says, "Look, there are all kinds of things you don't understand, Tommy, and I can't tell you about them. Things about Hailsham, about your place in the wider world, all kinds of things. But perhaps one day you'll try and find out. They won't make it easy for you, but if you want to, really want to, you might find out." I would maybe consider underlining those lines and hanging on to them as you start reading chapter 10, part 2. Hey, thank you so much for sticking with this series. It's been a long time. I meant to get it done all before December, and here we are in February, and I'm only finishing part 1. So I appreciate your patience and you tuning in and checking it out. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I'm planning on continuing to finish the novel. And again, just thank you for the kind comments and the subscriptions and the likes and all that. It's really given me the boost I need to keep going and get these chapter reviews done. I'll see you in the next one. Happy reading.